Hello and welcome back to Sum It Up. I'm Joelle Martinez, joined again by my friend and colleague, Harry Hollins. And today we have a really important conversation and also an extraordinary guest. Today's show is about drawing power, how redistricting shapes our life. Often we can hear about redistricting in the news, which we're hearing about a lot, which we'll talk about today. But usually we only hear about this every 10 years or so, and oftentimes we are barely paying attention. But as we'll learn today from today's guest, redistricting has an impact on many things: the balance of power, who represents us, and what we're really wanting to dive deep in today is how those decisions impact the way money flows, how it impacts our communities, and how it impacts our economic prosperity. So it is a real pleasure for me to get to bring on my friend, my longtime friend, many, many years, LLI alumna. Also, if I'm fully being transparent, also the first employee I ever hired at the LLI many years ago, but really a national legal expert, a brilliant mind in all things redistricting, my dear friend, Olivia Mendoza. Thank you so much for squeezing us in today. I know you are extraordinarily busy right now.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this really critical moment in our democracy. And a lot of things are flying right now.
Understatement, I know. But Harry, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Liv, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've been chomping at the bit waiting for this because you said it can't think of a more important and relevant discussion given the moment that we're in. And I want to dive, and we're going to dive deep into your work and your organization, but I also want to take a quick step back and just have you talk about your journey to the position that you're in, how you arrive there. Joel and I often talk, and most of our careers are never a straight line. It's usually pretty jagged, but would love to hear you and your journey and how you ended up exactly where you are today.
Thanks, Harry. Yeah, it's so great to see you. You know, it's really interesting because I started down this path following my heart. I am a community organizer, to my core. I started off in nonprofits and really helping the Latino community in Colorado. And that journey led me to become the executive director of a nonprofit named Claro and the C4, which is the Colorado Latino Forum. And during my time there, I really started to understand the impact and the power of public policy and how it impacts our community, how it impacts the state of Colorado, and also the lack of advocacy and voices for the Latino community in some key decision making. And that really became clear during the 2010 redistricting process. And so I started to, probably naively so, really get involved and try to impact the way redistricting was happening here in Colorado. And ultimately, that led us to the courtroom where we were litigating the maps. And our organization was a key advocate for the Latino community. And so I was a witness talking about how those lines were impacting the Latino community and in my opinion, not helping the Latino community the way they had been drawn. And I just had a moment in that courtroom, Harry, where I was looking around at everyone and I thought to myself, they're not smarter than me. I can do this. I actually, my whole life had wanted to be an attorney, but didn't know how that process worked. I didn't even know what the LSAT was, let alone all the other barriers to law school. And so I started dipping my toe in it, and with the support of my family and great friends like Joelle and others in the community, ended up just leaving my career and going to law school. Very much mid-career, so non-traditional in that sense. I was married, had kids, mortgage, the whole shebang, but really wanted to pursue this.
I want to pick back on what you just said. Was there a moment, or you've been in the courtroom, been through law school, was there a moment you realized how big your work was? Like, how we're talking societal impacts, we're talking generational impacts from decisions are made. Was there a moment or a time when you when it hits you just the magnitude of your work, it's not about Denver, Colorado, it's the country, and in many instances it's the world because of kind of the power center being in the United States.
Yeah, no pressure, but yes, I've had those moments multiple times along my career, and most recently in the reality that we're living in right now. And I know we're going to touch on what is happening, but I think that every time I'm involved in a case, whether it was when I was the witness in the case here in Colorado, or now in my new role where we are supporting plaintiffs and fighting maps all across the country, I am always acutely aware of the impact that these lines, the way these districts are shaped, how they impact, real people, everyday people, the Latino community, the Black community, all these communities that are often marginalized. And it's so eye-opening to realize how the system is sometimes we think that we have the power to influence an election when we vote. And we do. But that's not the first step. The first step is actually who are we electing? Like, how are they being added to the ballot? And that's where redistricting starts. So it's almost like redistricting is step 0, voting is step 1, and that's just the baseline. If you're voting, that's not enough. You need to be voting and advocating and calling, really involved, because democracy doesn't happen to us. It is us. We're the ones making it happen. So I think every time, Harry, that I have been in that space and understood the impact of the fight, the litigation, it is very good reminder that it is real people that are impacted every day.
Yeah, I was thinking back as you were talking in the early basement before we founded Claro and built the organization, and it was about maps and representation and redistricting. Remember, we were looking at how few Latinos were representing the state of Colorado at the time, and we were working on maps in those early days. We were young. We were really young, Olivia. But you and I know all about redistricting, and this has been part of our work, but many don't. So take us back to kind of redistricting 101. What is it? You're talking about these maps having impacts long before elections. Please tell us why that is, what they are, what we need to know about redistricting.
Yes, so I'm going to talk about 2 things here because they're intertwined and both very important. So the way our country elects members to Congress and to our state legislature, either the state house or the state senate, is by creating districts in which people vote in, right? Because we are a direct democracy, or we are a democracy with, representation coming out of the voters in the elections. Well, the way these individuals are identified as to who you're voting for is by the creation of the districts. And that's what redistricting is. We're creating the districts that then people will go in and vote for their elected official based on where you live. And sometimes people will ask me, well, why don't we just create straight lines? And why don't we just create little boxes in the state? And then that way there's no gerrymandering. Well, because there's some rules that dictate how we redistrict. And for the congressional maps, right, for electing our members of the House of Representatives, the districts have to be equal in population. So as you can imagine, here in Colorado, for example, the number of people that live in Denver and Fort Collins and Colorado Springs, the Western Slope, those populations vary. And so because of that, the district lines sometimes they look different, they're not linear, but it's because you're trying to create districts where each district is equal in population. And that's really important because you want everyone's vote to count equally, right? You don't want urban districts to have more power or less power, depending on how the districts are drawn, or to leave rural communities out from their ability to influence, who they're electing to Congress. And so that's why Redistricting really matters in regards to how the lines are drawn, and it differs based on where you live. But even before that is the census. Like, how do we even understand how many people should be in one district? And that's through the census. And so those are the two pieces that I think are really important for everyone to understand today, is that the census counts. It matters so much. And there is a constitutional requirement that the census count everyone in this country, every person that is living here at the time that the census is, being executed, that they're counted, and then we take those numbers and identify how many people need to live in the districts, and then you take those numbers and decide, okay, how do we shape these lines?
Yeah. And just as a follow-up, thank you for that background and what they are and how they get structured. But why does it matter? How does it influence these districts? So it influences who we get to vote for in that next election. But how do these districts then ultimately tie directly to school funding and healthcare and infrastructure, and how those communities then are represented?
Yeah, so again, there's two major ways to think about how redistricting impacts our everyday lives, right? And I think that's what you're asking me, Joelle, is how does the funding, the money, which is what drives our systems, right? Which is how systems operate. How is that impacted by redistricting? So going back to the census, it is impacted by the census, right? So once it is clear what the count is in our country, then that count is used to allocate federal dollars. We're talking highways, schools, higher education, research. All of that is connected to an accurate count from the census. But the other way in which it impacts our lives is what we're watching happen right now. So for those that followed, the big beautiful bill, I guess is what it is being called. I strongly disagree. I think that is an inaccurate name for what was passed. But what that federal legislation did was cut a lot of money that is coming to states, directly impacting people we know. Medicaid, Medicare, access to higher education funds for research, for federal grants, right, for federal scholarships, and access to money for students to go to college. So much impact on our daily lives. And that is a direct reflection of who was voted into Congress. Well, again, just connecting the dots here, how are people voted into Congress? Out of the districts in which they're representing. And how are those districts created? During the redistricting process. So it is a direct tie to the impact on our daily lives. And I will say that my uncle brought me a letter from the Social Security Administration saying they were cutting, $150, which is a lot of money per month for someone who lives on Social Security. And he's like, did I do something? Did I miss? Did I fill out the application wrong? Why are they just taking this money away? And the answer was federal legislation, the bill that had just passed out of this Congress and signed by President Trump, automatically started to decrease the amount of money he was going to be receiving on a monthly basis. And so explaining to our family members and our loved ones that redistricting matters, and you're going to see it show up sometimes in the form of a letter from the government saying you're not getting these resources anymore.
It's incredible. So, I have to ask from that, Olivia, is you have the rules, and obviously you know the rules deeply in your work and as an attorney, but then there's these other factors, right? So we know the census, we know the population. What drives whether a line goes right or left, up or down? Because one community on the left could look different than the one on the right. So obviously, just so everyone listening understands, yes, there's kind of these rules and understanding, but then what plays in deciding how these shapes, because it's more than right than just how these squiggly lines end up.
Well, if I could get into the minds of the map drawers, I would answer that question for you. But let me talk a little bit about the other rules and laws that dictate how maps are drawn. So I talked about equal population being one of them. And depending on the state that you're in, the maps are drawn either by your state legislature or by a citizen-led commission. In Colorado, our maps are drawn by a citizen-led commission, and this happened through a reform effort, a ballot initiative that people in Colorado voted on. And so the maps are decided not by those already in office, but everyday people like you and Joelle, myself, anyone that applies to be on that commission and is selected draws those lines. And that is the case in like California and Michigan and other states. But most states, it's the elected officials themselves that are drawing the lines for themselves, right? Something about that feels a little backwards, but they are still required to follow the law. So we have the federal law around equal one person, one vote. There is constitutional laws that say you can't, draw the lines predominantly thinking about race. So in a way that race is the predominant factor. And also there are federal laws like the Voting Rights Act. As of right now, anyway, it is still intact. And that law also says you can't draw lines in a way that even if your intent, you don't need to prove intent of why they were drawing the lines this way, but if they still dilute the votes of minority voters, then those maps are not constitutional. And that is a couple of big cases coming up in the U.S. Supreme Court this year that we're supporting and we're fighting at that level to continue to maintain those protections for communities of color, right? All of these protections came out of the Reconstruction era when there were so many laws that were designed to intentionally hurt and dilute and disenfranchise communities of color. And so these laws were put in place to mitigate against that. So those are the rules and the laws that partly dictate how maps are drawn. And then sometimes there are state rules, there are state laws that say you have to keep the districts compact, or you have to take the interest of the communities into mind. So people can come and talk about I'm going to give again an example because we're here in Colorado, Aurora, right? Sometimes you might have the city of Aurora is massive. It's a huge city, and it spans the entire, western side of the city. I had to do my math really quick. So the eastern side of Denver, and some of it is closer to like Adams County, and some of it's in Arapahoe County. Well, the community themselves can come forward and say we are more closely aligned with Adams County or Arapahoe or Denver, and share their stories. Where do they shop? Where do they go to school? Where do they live in community? And that should also inform how the maps are drawn. So people have an input. But then it's up to the map drawers, whether it's the commissioners or the legislators, to take all of this input, right? Federal laws, state laws, community input, and decide to how they prioritize the lines. There's a lot more that goes into it, but I think that that's kind of a good overview of how you actually start crafting the lines for districts.
And we've had rules and they change, and we've had ways of doing this every 10 years. Today is different. Talk to us a little bit about what is happening. Be on it, like what is going on? We hear about Texas and we hear about California, we hear about Michigan. What is happening today with redistricting, and why is it maybe not normal?
It is not normal. Let me start there. What is happening right now, what we are facing, I have to yell this from the rooftops every time I get invited to any event or a party, even my own family events. I am constantly talking about we need to be paying attention to what is happening. Our democracy is like being pulled out from underneath us at this very moment. And this mid-decade redistricting that is really an arms race to the bottom for redistricting is happening for no reason. This doesn't have to happen. But the reason why we see the headlines talking about Texas is going to redraw, and then California and Missouri and Indiana, well, all of these legislators are being literally called to the White House, like in Indiana, or in Texas, the phone calls from the White House. with the president essentially trying to steal the 2026 election right now, today, in 2025. And the way they do that is by, for no reason, like there's no court order, there's no new census, there's no rationale as to why you suddenly need to redraw these maps, but they are doing that because they are worried about being accountable to the people because of the legislation, right? All the terrible things that we've been seeing coming out of the administration that are hurting people, Republicans and Democrats, everyone, there's so much evidence that people are not pleased with the legislation and the way it's impacting their lives. And they know that. And so the only way to maintain power is to redraw the lines in a way that ensures their ability to be elected again to Congress. And this is, I'm just going to call it what it is. This is stealing. They are stealing these districts, and they're doing it on the backs of communities of color. In Texas, they specifically drew maps that targeted Black and Latino communities in the metro areas, in the Rio Grande Valley, all over San Antonio, and just either pack them all into one district so that it dilutes their votes, or took those communities and spread them out across all of these other rural districts, which also dilutes their votes. Both of those concepts, cracking and packing, hurt these communities. And now we see California saying, whoa, this is really bad. But they have a citizen-led commission, right? That the legislature doesn't draw their maps. So California is doing it a different way, and they're going to the people and saying, hey, we think we need to redraw our maps to combat what Texas is doing, because Texas is trying to steal 5 seats in Congress. And we think we can slow that down, put a buffer to stop that. But they're actually asking the people to vote on it. Right. And it's also a temporary fix in California. After this process, the commission would go back into place. So I do want to be very clear that what is happening in Texas is nothing like what is happening in California. California is standing up to what Texas is doing, but this is just the beginning. Like, we are seeing the dominoes start to fall in every state that has a Republican legislature that is being influenced by Donald Trump to essentially redraw the districts for no reason other than to ensure that the House of Representatives elects more Republicans, even if that is not the will of the people.
And I just have to add this before jumping over to Harry on the, kind of political games that get played, having, spent a big part of my career, and then is that this will just set precedent. And then the rules are rewritten, and both parties will leverage those new rules to, play this power game. I mean, this is how, so I think going back to your comment about raising this even at family events, which I can attest she does, is that it's about democracy. It's about maintaining those pillars of democracy that are critical, and then holding everyone accountable to them, regardless of party. Everyone needs to be held accountable to the tenets of democracy. And I think that's a really, when people ask what's at stake, that's at stake. And I please tell me, that I'm not over dramatizing this.
No, it is at stake. When I say that what is happening right now, it keeps me up. It keeps me up at night. I have, not young kids. I have teenagers. I worry about them. Like, what do they understand democracy to mean? Because they are living in a world that isn't reflecting democratic values at all. And what is life going to be like for them? So I cannot understate the importance of this moment, and every person and every voice needs to be lifting up. This is, I said it earlier, but oftentimes we think that exercising our right to vote is like us being, great citizens, and we are good citizens for doing that, but that is not sufficient. That is the floor. And not just now, but every day, because you need to be understanding what are these games that are being played? How is the system trying to be rigged? What are these power grabs that are happening at the expense of our votes and our ability. What they're doing is turning the table. Instead of us being able to choose who represents us, they're choosing who's going to vote for them, right? And that is the antithesis of what our democracy should look like.
I have to ask you a question I would have thought would have been theoretical. Although there's a lot of probably areas that we could have discussions around that and say we're in uncharted waters, but this may not be theoretical in play. What, in your opinion, would be some of the legal and political implications if multiple states responded the way they did? So we have Texas, we have California, we have Michigan, we have New York. But what if you started, I don't think we've ever had a time in history where you have 15, 20, 25 states. What if that happened? Is that good? Is that bad? What would be the implications if this became the new normal across all 50 states?
I don't think it's theoretical, Harry. I think it is very, very possible, right? Each state has a different process, and so each state would have to really consider what their challenges are and what they can viably do to redraw. But stepping out of my role in the work I do and just thinking about this from someone who cares about our policies and our work, it's bad. Like, how can we become a country that just redraws our power structures whenever at the whim of whomever's in control of the White House? I'm not trying to say I just don't think that's not what we learned in civics, right? That is not what we have been taught is a good model for a thriving democracy. And I don't want to sugarcoat it. Like, our democracy has its problems with or without mid-decade redistricting, right? There's problems in the way the power structure exists. But this is a whole new monster that once you uncork it is very difficult to tame, right? Now, I do think that there's value in states that are paying attention and watching what Texas did and what Missouri is saying they're going to do and what Indiana is saying they're going to do, to stand up and say, no, we're the line to protect this democracy, right? From a posture of like a temporary solution. I agree with Joelle in what you just shared, that we don't want this to become the new normal, or we're going to redistrict in 5 years as is required, right? Because the census will happen in 2030 and redistricting will be in 2031. We don't want to be just going through this, it's a merry-go-round that we want to get off of. But we have to stay on it because we can't let this happen while we're sleeping. And I think about, when the president called the Secretary of State in Georgia, and he was like, I just need you to get me, 1,100 more votes, or I can't even remember the exact number, but really pressuring him to change the outcome of the election. And they stood up and they said, no, that's not how this works here. Well, it's the same kind of thing that's happening right now, only people aren't standing up. The legislators that he's calling, the Republican legislators, are saying, okay, we'll redraw. Sounds good. I don't know what they're exchanging in return, their souls maybe, but a lot of backdoor deals probably happening to come to this agreement. But somebody has to stand up and say, we can't allow for this to happen.
Yeah. So I know we're running short on time because your time is in demand, to say the least. But, you mentioned that folks aren't necessarily getting involved, and, we're all dealing with so much in our daily lives. What is one or two things that folks can do to kind of take the power back, particularly right now in this moment? What are some areas that they can get involved and get engaged and get informed?
Yeah, I think that, again, going back to my roots, I am an organizer at heart, and the power is always with the people. So if you live in Colorado, there's a lot to do here in Colorado in regards to staying engaged and understanding what is happening in the other states, keeping our elected officials accountable by as the legislation is passed that hurts your communities, calling and talking and emailing and being a vocal constituent to put pressure on your elected officials to actually represent you, right? If you don't live in the state of Colorado, then you should make sure that you know what is happening. Is your state engaging in mid-decade redistricting? And if they are, then you need to be organizing and vocal, because, silence is supporting the power, right? It's easy to say, I'm too tired. I'm stressed out about money. There's things happening in my family. I'm just going to bury my head because I can't deal with the news. And I get that. And I empathize with that. I feel that too sometimes. But if we close our eyes for too long, we're going to open them up and not recognize the world that we live in anymore. So stay engaged wherever you live, understand what is happening now and between now and the 2026 election.
Olivia, this could go on forever. I know it can't. For everyone listening today, you might be wondering, why is the LLI picking up on redistricting? And what you need to know is we've actually talked about redistricting. Even in our fellowship, we would take a weekend to talk about power and power structures and how power is built and how we need to get involved. Oftentimes, we don't know that elections are determined long before election day through the process of redistricting. And today, well, these times are different. And so the best thing that we can do as an organization is create a platform where we can learn the facts, learn from folks on the ground who just happen to be in our familia, in our LLI network, be informed and get engaged. Because redistricting not only is connected to power, but it's connected to economic outcomes and the flow of money and the flow of support into our communities. And oftentimes our communities are invisible in that process. But Olivia, thank you for making sure that we have someone at the table fighting for these communities, informing communities. Thank you so much for being generous with your time, knowing how busy you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Olivia.
Thank you both.
Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Bye.
Take care.